Ugh, fucked up my own intro. Hey everybody, Alex here, and welcome to another video, a discussion video. I feel like I haven't done one of these in a minute. So, disclaimer here. This is not a hit thing, this is not a rant, this is not me complaining, it's meant to spark discussion. Some of the examples here may or may not paint a game in a negative light, but for the most part, it's enjoyable. It's more so just to get a discussion going. So, I will lead this with, what do you feel about video game storylines? Do you think they take themselves too seriously? Do you think they're kind of forced on you? Or do you think they're too long? Or too short? Or just not needed at all? So, what really sparked me wanting to have this topic, or this video rather, is a conversation I actually had with a friend of mine a few days ago, talking about a game that I just recently finished, which is Plague Tale Requiem. So, a little background on my buddy. I did ask him if he'd be interested in doing kind of like an interview podcasty thing. He'd rather not, and reason therein is because he actually teaches creative writing, literature, and costume design at a local university, and he is scared shitless if his students see him on the internet. Even though I told him this is not like CNN, you don't have to worry about it. And he also doesn't really play games. He is pretty much a Candy Crush fiend and Animal Crossing because that's his lifeblood. So, me talking about games like Plague Tale and JRPGs and stuff completely in over his head until I got a little bit into the weeds of how the story was presented and everything else. Then he was like, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from. So, not only that, he's also my favorite non-best-selling author. He's written 3 different novels, one of which was an erotic novel, a sports erotic novel, which he wrote for fun, is also a form of expression for himself, and then 2 other novels, both in the fiction genre. Asked me not to give the names of those either, just because he, basically, as he put it, I don't need my taxes getting fucked up. And again, I'm like, this is not a big deal show. He doesn't even watch this channel. I just told him I have a YouTube channel and I talk about video games, and he goes, that's very you. He didn't even know until I brought it up. So I was playing Plague Tale Requiem, and as of this recording, I had just finished it. And I couldn't help but notice a feature on the PS5 is it gives you a percentage, for certain PS5 games, it gives you your time spent and your percentage towards finishing it. And at about the 12, 13 hour mark of this game, and Requiem is the sequel, by the way, it said I was at like 52, 54%. And I just went, fucking how? Like, this game should have ended already. And I'm not even talking about the time spent. I meant where I was in the story. Because, as a bunch of you guys know, video game stories to me are always paramount. I want to know the next story beat. But sometimes I feel like the gameplay just got in the way. And at that 14-ish hour mark, seeing it only at 52% and where the story was, I was like, oh boy, there's going to be some padding. So ultimately, it took me just over 20 hours. And I'll be honest with you, I felt like this thing could have ended at 15, 16, maybe 17 pushing it. And ultimately, for me, I did enjoy the game. I really do enjoy stealth gameplay as a whole. But there's some, and I hate to use this term because everybody who talks about video game stories uses it, there's pacing problems. So I mentioned all this to him, and I brought up like in context of the story and what was going on. And right off the bat, he just said this writer needs an editor. And I was like, well, yeah, but I would almost say maybe the gameplay design got in the way. You know, I spent how many hours throwing rocks at dudes' heads, and jumping in and out of tall grass and all this other stuff. And he goes, no. And he told me a story, which was actually really interesting. So when he wrote his first novel, it was not self-published. He wrote it back before self-publishing on Amazon and all that stuff was a thing. So he was sourcing out different publishers to pick up his first book. And ultimately, in the US, nobody wanted it. Until he found somebody out in the UK. And at the time, he was actually living out of the UK. He was going to move back to the States. Pretty much they were like, yeah, send us the manuscript, we'll take a look at it, but premise-wise, sounds pretty interesting. Send us the complete manuscript. So he did, and he said it was like 325 pages. It came back at 250, and he was appalled. he was like, what did they change? Like, all of this was important stuff because he ran through it himself. Mind you, he has a PhD in creative writing. Like, who the fuck is telling him how to write his novel? Like, that sort of thing. And he went through the edits. Grammatically, he had no problems whatsoever. Tense-wise, like past, present, future, had like maybe one or two instances on all his pages. But then there's like an entire chapter he said that just got struck out. And it literally just said useless fluff. And for him, that chapter was incredibly important. Because, again, you know, he teaches costume design. So in theaters, he explained it to me. Obviously, if you go see like Death of a Salesman, for instance, you know, it's a cohesive story about a salesman. You throw a guy in a suit, you have a family at home, presumably like we'll say the stay-at-home mom thing, nuclear family thing. You already know, oh, dad's stressed out, dad's in a suit, he must be a salesman. Or he must work in business. Or he must be a salary guy. Whatever. That's the blanket definition. If you put him in a tight-fitting modern suit, it's in the year 2000 onward. If you put him in a slightly larger oversized suit, we're in the 90s and 80s. You throw a hat on him, we're in the 1950s. The costumes tell a story to coincide and set a time and place for something, or to give you an insight into somebody's personality. Maybe he has the tie undone. Maybe he's exhausted by the end of the day. Maybe he's incredibly disheveled. Maybe, you know, he's like one shirt tail is sticking out and he's like bouncing around and the suit's dirty. You know, maybe that tells you he's hard on his luck. Maybe he said, I just came from a bar. You look at his attire. Obviously, he had a lot to drink. There's storytelling within the costume design. So for this particular character in the novel, he was trying to describe how flashy he was and to give you insight into, despite his, you know, appearance of being like a flash cat, as he put it, whatever that means, you know, deep down, this was a shield to cover up his own personal insecurities. And the editor literally sliced out this whole thing because he did top to bottom, talked about the rings, the earrings, the hat, the shoes, the shirt, the coat, the bag, everything. Everything basically screamed like 1980s glam. And the author's like, you don't need to say any of that. I mean, not the author. The editor said, you don't need to say any of this. You already gave us the destination. You already described his personality. You said he wore very gaudy clothing. You know, you could give one or two paragraphs describing what it looked like. Let your audience determine the appearance in their head. You are selling this book to other people. You are not selling it, your vision, to somebody else. And again, as a writer, he's like, no, I want people to see my story. And they say, and the editor came back and said, yes, but you have to allow it for interpretation. Plus, from a pacing perspective, all of this description followed by an entire 10 pages about shoes and socks breaks the flow. You should know this. Literally. And he was like, you know, pompous British prick. But after reading through a couple different edits, some stuff got put back in, of course. He understood where this editor was coming from. And he was like, okay, I get it now. The book does, in fact, flow a lot better. I can see from a consumer standpoint why this is more marketable than my original. However, if you ever go to his house, he has two versions of the book. He has his original, and then he has the commercial version. And he'll always say the original version was probably his best work, but also a wake-up call, because he realized, yes, you have to be creative, but at the same time, you also have to appease an audience too, right? Based on what you're trying to sell, as it were. And basically what I was saying to him, when it comes to video games that try to tell a really cohesive story or something deep and dark, or at least give you a setting, and using Plague Tale as an example, you know, you watch the trials and tribulations of Amicia and Hugo. I'm not going to give any spoilers, by the way, for the first game or the second game. But this picks up a couple months after the first game left off. And basically, stuff, as these things go, you start on a high, and it slowly descends into madness, right? However, based on my description, he understood the push-pull, as he described it. It's a push from creative, and it's a pull it back from an editor, from some sort of producer, a director. And, you know, he was like, yeah, it reaches a point where, you know, the the creative is like, you have to finish my story. You have to finish my story. But then the director is like, if we finish your story, we have no gameplay. And based on my description, he even said, yeah, if it ended when you thought it should end, dude, you lost like 6 hours worth of game there. And maybe from a director producer standpoint, they're like, no, this game has to be at least 18 hours. So what suffers? The story, the pacing, stuff he's like gets thrown in that doesn't need to be there. The exact opposite problem of what I had with my first book, where I was throwing in stuff that the editor said, hey, this doesn't need to be there. In the case of your video game, it sounds like somebody said, no, we need more of this. We need to have, my favorite, we need to have 3 sections of endless dudes. Because when they get to the next story beat, there will be such a great payoff. But there's a problem with that too. And I'm going to cite something towards the end of the game, but I'm not going to be specific. There is a very critical and emotional moment that happens towards the end of the game. And it culminates with Hugo basically going a little off kilter, I'll say. And it's a very powerful scene. It's really cool visually, and it's really emotional. And then I died in the middle of it, and I had to do it again. Shit happens. It took me 4 times to finally get to the cutscene after this emotional event. And guess what? It meant nothing. And it really sucked. I was like, wow, this would have been so much more powerful if it didn't take me 4 tries to get through it. And, I described that instance to him. And he made an interesting argument. And I say interesting argument because, remember, he doesn't play games. He goes, why not just make it a movie? And I go, oh, like the game itself? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, as a medium, like, it's a video game studio, and it's an independent project. And he's like, no. I mean, like, in this instance, why can't they just give you one long movie to wrap everything up? And I was like, I had to go into this whole thing about Hideo Kojima. And after that, he kind of tuned out and he said, I need another drink. I said there's a push-pull with that. Some people say there's too much cinematic. Sometimes people say there's too little cinematic. Sometimes people say there's not enough gameplay. And because it's all because it's all like high-intense graphics and motion capture, sometimes this cost doesn't allow it. And it's actually more expensive it's less expensive to cut and paste a gameplay section in that may have been cut out previously, or a map, because they tend to over-design for the purpose of having like a back catalog of stuff. I was like, if you look at art books for video games, you'll see tons of stuff that was never used. And he's like, yeah, but couldn't you like make it easier or something? And I'm like, I don't know if it changes that, because I played it on normal and I'm not going back to do it again. But it was fascinating just to hear his immediate reaction is, why not just make it a movie? And I thought about that because the last, I'll say, 3.5, 4 hours of the game, while it does try to wrap things up, and I do think that is largely because of a concern of maybe not being able to make a third one, or truthfully, with the state of the industry in 2024, I mean, this game came out a couple years ago, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if you're ever going to finish your story. I even said to him, I said, dude, you write a book, you have the option of self-publishing it on Amazon now. You don't need to wait for somebody else to pick it up for the sake of marketing it. You could just go on Instagram and all that stuff and, push it to your students. And he was like, no, that's a conflict of interest. He's like, I like my job. I don't want to get fired. But video game guys, I was like, they don't really have that option unless they go indie. And indie development is expensive. It's very high risk. And, I told him stories about all these Kickstarters, too. He knows what Kickstarter is. And I say, they'll say, yeah, we need $60,000. I was like, but guess what? They've never had to do this themselves before. So what they think is $60,000 after fees and everything is really 40, and then they find out they really needed $1 million. So I was like, there's a lot of risk versus the reward when it comes to video game design. I was like, joking with him, of course. I was like, as opposed to sitting in your apartment, punching out a novel, like on a semi-regular basis, or at least going through a couple of chapters, when the mood strikes you. And but to his point, he even said, yeah, but when it comes to a creative process, he's like, an author or a writer doesn't sit down for 5 days straight and just writes the whole story. Like, there's a preparation time, there's a writing time, there's a revisit time. Like, they need to be the masters of their own lore to realize 6 months ago they said something that's going to come back to bite them in the butt, and they all of a sudden have to rewrite 3 chapters. He's like, the writing perspective of it, by the time you get to the end, it is like a child. So the fact that somebody comes and tells you to cut it out is very hurtful. And I was like, huh, very interesting. And I agreed with him. I said, you know, there's tons of music. I mean, I'm more into music, obviously. But there's tons of artists that I listen to where, you know, they'll repeat a section of a bridge, or they'll throw in a breakdown, or they'll just do, you know, a chorus that goes on maybe 1 or 2 verses too long, or even my YouTube videos, because I am a long-winded individual. Sometimes you just need somebody to cut it out. And truthfully, I've tried to incorporate some jump cuts here and there, or at least cut out stuff where I tend to repeat myself, because I think it's needed to a point. But guess what? I've been doing this since like 2011 on and off, and here we are in 2024-ish, and I am just now doing that. You know, and is it better for it? I don't know. Do I feel better about it? Yeah. If a video is going to be 45 minutes as opposed to an hour, cool. Like, you guys have presumably another 15 minutes rather to find something else to put in the background. But, you know, following all of that, when I explained the conclusion and everything of the story to him, because honestly, he's like, I'm never going to play this shit. I showed him screenshots and some gameplay, and he was like, man, girl looked busted. What happened to her? Then I had to tell him the whole thing. And he was immediately like, oh my God, these poor kids. And then when I described everything, he's like, oh, so it's like with the plague and stuff. He thought it was really cool. He was like, this is brilliant. He's like, dude, if this was a movie, I would totally watch it. And I was like, I'm like, you're going to die on that hill, aren't you? And at that point, he had a few too many cups of coffee. If you know, you know. And the conversation started to go a little left. But interestingly enough, I did ask him. I said, okay, let's flip the script here. Haha, a little bit. As somebody who plays Candy Crush, which he does a lot, and he's very, very, like, he pretty much, I'm convinced he owns shares of King, or Activision at this point, or Microsoft, whoever the fuck owns it at this point. I said, how would you feel about a huge convoluted story in your Candy Crush? And he said, and I quote, bitch, I just want to match 3 and get to work. I was like, okay, interesting you say that, because, and then I had to explain Puyo Puyo to him. I was like, and he just looked at me and went, I don't fucking care. He's like, he likes puzzle games, right? So he was like, I don't need a story. He's like, I really don't need a story. He's like, I just want to match stuff. I want to get that euphoria of stuff falling down, and I want to see numbers going up, and I want to move on with my life. Then I talked about Tetris Effect and how it's a visual musical experience. And he literally said, OMG, that sounds like some convoluted, like, hippie bullshit. And then I showed him some gameplay of Tetris Effect, and I explained with the VR headset and all that. And he was like, he said, I would never be into that. And I was like, then he said, is there a story? I go, no, but there's like background stuff, you know, with the music, you can kind of infer it. It's an art piece, right? And he goes, okay, art piece stuff I can get behind. But if you're telling me Tetris has a story, then I told him about the Tetris movie. And he was like, oh, bitch. He's like, this is ridiculous. He's like, it's a video game. Why is it so serious? And then, and this is where the conversation really went off the rails, I told him I'm into JRPGs. And he's like, you know, what's a JRPG? And I was like, it's a RPG that comes from Japan. And, you know, very anime and all that stuff. And, you know, I went into it. And I told him one of the things that I always harp on with animes and JRPGs as a whole is that they never know how to end. If you watch any anime, almost any anime, when you get to the last couple of episodes, they always tend to rush through a bunch of things to try to tie up loose ends. And then the last episode, at least for me, seems to fail to deliver. The only one that really did, truthfully for me, was Gundam Iron Blood Orphans. That was really emotional for me. But something like Witch of Mercury, Code Geass, okay. And my beloved Gurren Lagann, I have no fucking idea what happened. And even like Death Note had a really satisfying one. But the lead up to it is always, it to me always feels so rushed. And in the case of JRPGs, there are always these last 4-hour dungeons, and then boss fights that just never end, and everybody has to say something, and everybody has to give a piece, and everybody has a realization, and all this stuff. And he's like, yeah, but you like that, right? And I'm like, yeah, I like that. And he goes, yeah, and if they keep doing it, that means that they are effectively selling the story to the right audience. Story-wise. From a gameplay perspective, he's like, maybe you're just tired of it because that's the part you want to get to. And I was like, huh. I never thought of it like that. Like, these dungeons should be shorter for the sake of getting to the story. And he literally said to me, yeah, we call that pacing. And I was like, huh. So every game I actually really enjoy has some degree of pacing problems. Interesting. Because almost every single RPG review I read says pacing problems. But in terms of story, not in terms of gameplay. And he goes, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just telling you, like, as a writer, I'd be like, you know, why are we running around circles for half an hour when we just want to go kill the dragon thing? And I was like, well, you know, it's a dungeon and, you know, whatever. But it was really interesting to hear somebody from the outside say that to me. Because even he said, you know, it reaches a point where he's like, I have to remember, this is a video game, right? Are you playing it for the story? Yeah. Is the story a backdrop? Yeah. Is it giving me a motivation to want to finish it? Sure. Do you have characters that you like, characters that you dislike? Do you see character development that you want to see to the finish? Or do you want to see somebody get the payoff, or do you want to see somebody die, or whatever, right? He's like, if you get all that in the gameplay and you have something that keeps you engaged, he's like, then they did a good job. But if you're getting to the end and you're getting exhausted, he's like, as a writer, to me that says maybe you went on a little bit too long. And I was like, yeah, because these games tend to go on like 70, 80, sometimes 100 hours. And he was like, you play that shit for that long? I was like, well, how many hours do you have in Candy Crush? And he's like, I don't know. And I was like, well, how many hours do you have in Animal Crossing? He's like, oh, over 1,000. But he said the difference is, he's like, he does it because he likes that, and I like Animal Crossing. I'm gonna say he likes that monotony. He likes the daily task thing. To him, it's like wake up, do a bunch of stuff, turn it off. Like I told him, I said, you would thrive in an MMO with daily quests. Like, that's his thing. He likes to know, like, oh, I did my chores and now I can go on with the rest of my day. He's very much, his personality is very much like that. But, you know, me going in on how, like, Persona 3 operates, or any Persona game, rather, with, like, a social link system and all that, you know, he's like, I'm in a school all day. I don't need to get school in my game. But he's like, I would enjoy that sort of gameplay loop where I have like a set list of stuff I can do in a given day, and then if you give me a story in the background that is subservient to like the tasks and everything, it kind of steers the story for like character development stuff. He's like, I could get behind that. He's like, I think that's brilliant. And I was like, yeah, well, those games are like 100 hours. And he's like, but is it like a good 100 hours, or do you get kind of bored with it? And I said, well, it depends on what it is, right? I was like, I like turn-based combat. The music is really cool. Then I had to show him screenshots and all that stuff because he had no idea what he's talking about. And he was like, he thought Joker was hot. So, but he was like, okay. He goes, these characters look fun. Like, I would be interested to see how they develop and why they look like this, you know? So he was like, he kind of understood where that whole video gamey part of like a JRPG or an RPG in general plays into story and whatnot. But then I told him, you know, there's some games that just basically give you like a very open-ended story, like your Skyrims and your Fallouts. It's basically just a means to throw you into a world. And he goes, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, you tell your own story. And then he's like, what's the ending? I'm like, well, there is like an end quest, but usually it's not, you know, the destination, it's how you get there. And he was like, huh, like, that's kind of cool. So I recommended him to check out Fallout 3, actually, because I hope his laptop can run it. So he's going to report back eventually after he's finally tried, because he watched the show and he really enjoyed it. And I was like, yeah, it's kind of like that. You pop out of a vault and a bunch of wacky shit happens. So he was going to check it out. And I only recommended Fallout 3 just because that's my personal favorite one. Um, I will admit New Vegas is a better game because of the storyline. He doesn't know my buddy who used to work at Obsidian, but I told him I know somebody who worked on that game and Knights of the Old Republic 2. Again, he had no idea what I was talking about. And he was just like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." So like why didn't I like? I told him it was due to the game. I had a glitch towards the end trying to get the big payoff. But I just gave him a basic synopsis of like the whole weird Walt Disney thing they had going on in there, and he was like, "Oh," he's like, "This sounds kind of cool," and he goes, "And now it's a show," and I was like, "Yes, and now it's a show." um, and then the conversation kind of steered into, we talked about interpretive storytelling, right? So of course, Dark Souls and Elden Ring have to come up, mandatory, and going back to his example of the costumes, I said, yeah, so as a costume design person, you feel like your costumes have to tell a story. He's like, they do. They have to set a time and place, and they have to at least give you an idea of who the character is, where they are in their lives, and their personality. So me going on about Elden Ring and armor sets and all that stuff, and I'm only going to cite my boy Artorias of the Abyss because, I told him in Dark Souls, you basically are told like there's a final flame from the King of Embers or whatever it was. The final flame. I can't remember. I was drunk when we had this conversation, by the way. So, but I told him basically they give you a premise of the world and then they toss you into it, and basically you get lost and you die a bunch, and you fight all these ridiculous bosses, and the world design is ultimately what tells you the story. And when you pick up sets of armor, yeah, they look cool. Some of them look like absolute shit. Some pieces tell you a story, like about your Artorias of the Abyss or Solaire or something like that, or an idea of like the Order, or you find an NPC that will give you like a snippet of dialogue, and it's all obtuse enough where you can make your own personal interpretation. And he was like, "That sounds really cool." And then he looked it up and he watched I showed him some gameplay and stuff like that. And he was like, yeah, he's like, he completely tuned out. And then I gave him a link to VODvidya and I said, just watch this stuff. Maybe you'll find it interesting. I don't know if he has, but the idea of having like a sort of like how you do or how you make it sort of thing, he thought from like the perspective of a writer was very interesting. Especially when I told him they're all like that. And Elden Ring, George R.R. Martin helped with in terms of setting up the background lore and everything. And he was like, wow, so there really is an intermingling here. He had no idea. And, but, he did ask me an interesting question at the end. He goes, so, as somebody who's played a lot of video games, Alex, he goes, what is the most important thing to you in a video game? And I said, truthfully, I think it's the story. I primarily play role-playing games. I like to see where stories go. I love seeing character development. He and I had a bunch of the same literature classes in college. I was like, bro, you already know I like character development. I like coming-of-age stuff. I mean, what my thesis was on one, for Christ's sakes. And he's like, yeah, but, he's like, but, do you ever get bored of it? And I was like, no, because everybody has a different experience. And he's like, yeah. And as a writer, that's why it's kind of annoying when one of his novels, which was meant to be more satirical, got shredded to pieces because they're like, nobody lives like this. And he's like, bro, it's my fucking life. Like, he was good doing a riff off of like a David Sedaris like essay sort of novel, and but of his own life. And they were like, yeah, nope, this is too fantastical. And he's like, I didn't embellish a damn fucking thing. At least he didn't think so. But me telling him that, and then he goes, yet here you are complaining about pacing and having gameplay in the way of your story. And I was like, yeah, that's really interesting. And it made me think, video games have settings, right? Casual, easy, normal, or mid, whatever you want to call it. And then hard, extreme, and inferno. I always play my games on normal to start. They always say the recommended way to play. And then if you go to easy or casual, it says if you rather focus on the story. And he goes, how come you never pick that if you want to focus on the story? And I was like, because I bought a video game, not a book. Unless it's a visual novel, but that's a whole other topic. Um, and he goes, so you're kind of doing it to yourself then. And I was like, yeah, my problem is self-inflicted. That's really interesting. I never thought of it like that. It literally took somebody who has basically zero knowledge of video games to explain that to me. And it was kind of eye-opening. Now, mind you, I'm not going and playing casual and everything. Like, screw that noise. But sometimes, but he's right. Sometimes the method of gameplay, even if you enjoy it, is a hindrance on the payoff you want. Whether it be the story. Maybe there's too much story. Maybe you rather focus on the gameplay itself. That's why some games like shooters have arcade mode and story mode. You don't care about the 5 seconds of cutscenes in and after each chapter explaining why this character lost their clothes, or bippity boppity boo, we have to rescue the princess too. You don't care about that. You just want to shoot down ships. You just want to punch dudes in the face. You want to throw barrels, what have you. That is a gameplay. That is a design perspective where somebody recognizes, okay, we're throwing in the story for the people who want the story, like your Double Dragons, your Streets of Rages. You know, some people want to know that stuff. And then some people are just playing on the weekend with their buddy. They got it through GameFly. Maybe they're over at somebody's house and they're like, yo, let's do a co-op run, something like that. We don't care about the story. We just want to get to the gameplay. And sometimes, I'll be honest, the stories take themselves way too seriously for what they are. I love Puyo Puyo. I finished Puyo Puyo Tetris. No idea what happened in that story. I literally skipped every cutscene and just went through the puzzles because they got progressively more difficult or they changed the dynamics in order to complete them. That was the payoff for me. Thinking about this made me think back on something that Craig from TV and Lust said many, many, many years ago. And if you're new around here, TV and Lust was a YouTube channel back in the glory days of the YouTube gaming community. Pretty much he was a collector. He had a very large collection. He had endeavored to look at it from like a critical eye, so to speak, as in, I play games until I get my fulfillment or I get enough out of them, and then he talks about them. And since then, he curated it down because he realized there was just a bunch of stuff that he just had because he felt like he had to have it for the sake of, not saying I have a complete collection, but as a, I guess you could say, a library of video game history, which, you know, in today's talks of preservation is pretty interesting. But he said something on one of his podcasts, also known as TV and Lust. It had several folks on it. Steph's Two Defs used to be on it as well. And I remember he said something on one episode that I completely disagreed with, not to the point where I stopped listening. I appreciated his commentary. But I was actually like, you know, I clutched my pearls at that one. He said, you know, I think video game stories are trite, you know, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing. He goes, I really don't play them for the story. For me, gameplay is paramount. And this is somebody who plays Zelda games, RPGs, almost every single genre. He's like, I could give a rat's ass about it. You know, other than Zelda, that's pretty much the only one I care about. And I was like, how? And then he goes, yeah, and I don't really finish my games. You know, I play it until I'm like, okay, I feel full. I'm fulfilled from it. I got all I can get out of it. Whether that's 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, 50 hours, or maybe I ended up seeing the credits because I couldn't get enough of it. And as of this recording, he put up a post on his Instagram. He's still playing Destiny 2. I dropped Destiny 2 after the first story expansion, right? He's been playing it ever since. And they've had tons of story DLC since. If you ask him, I don't know how invested he is in the story, but I guarantee you he's like, yeah, it's there, it's fine. But, you know, I like the gunplay. At the time when he said that, you know, video game stories are not all that great. I was in such disagreement. For me, as somebody who does have difficulty reading without visual parts of it, that's why I like visual novels so much. I'm very much a visual person. Or having sound or voice or something like that. You know, there's a reason why my buddy took the literary path and I took the film path when it came for electives, because I need that visual part to it too, and that's why I resonate so much more with cinema and video games than I do with books. Anyway, I couldn't believe Craig said that, and I was in such disagreement. But now, as I've gotten older, and I've played more games, and I've seen how games have developed over time, they are becoming more cinematic, and to a point, I'm beginning to understand where he's coming from. And this is like, we're talking like 2006, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, something like that. Where video games were still in that weird spot where if a game had too many movies, it was really cool. Or if it had too many movies, it was no game. Or they'd be like, this game is only 6 hours and 5 of it are cutscenes. And maybe that influenced his opinion at the time. I don't know what his opinion is at this point. He's since really stopped posting anything video game related at all. But using Plague Tale as an example, pretty much I was at the point towards the end of the game. I was playing sections for the purpose of getting to cutscenes to finish the story. The game was not serving my payoff at that point. And that, I initially took it as a stance of it's the fault of the development team. It's the fault of the writers. They didn't edit enough or anything like that. And the more I think about it, is it true? Partially. Is it untrue? Partially. I could switch it to easy. I could have dumbed it down. I could have just said, okay, you know what? I'm going to do a run through because each section is barred off by a door that Almesia will put a lock on so that you can move on to the next bit, essentially. I could just run through, find the door, throw down a cloud of smoke, and just, I can nix all that. I can do my own editing. It's how you make it, right? I didn't do that. I was like, okay, fine. If I go that way and I path down this way, I can get this thing and I can get the enhancement thing over there. And I can, because I enjoy that part too. But when it becomes a chore, that's where I start to ask the question, why is this still going? But I have the option to not have it still going. To Craig's point, I could just drop it. I could say, okay, I got enough of this game. I'm just going to YouTube the ending because that's all I care about at this point. But you see, video games do a very interesting thing. At this point, it's called trophies. And that they use as a barometer for how many people actually do certain things, finish your game. And they monitor that severely. That is tied to if a game gets a sequel, if the next game is single player, if the game is multiplayer only. I mean, look at Call of Duty, for instance, right? They know people only play the story to learn how to play the game. It's not even a priority to them anymore. It's a wasted cost. It's a lost art. I mean, at one point they had a famous actor I'm not going to name because he got into some shit, and I don't know if it's resolved. That was like the heyday. I don't think that's a thing anymore. Your folks like your David Cage, who I am convinced really just wants to make a movie, but can't break into the movie industry, so he keeps making video games. His games are essentially movies disguised as point-and-click adventures, I would dare say. And I love the Telltale style with The Walking Dead and all that stuff. But they are really movies and TV shows disguised as point and clicks with QTEs and stuff like that. And that's a gameplay mechanic for a certain individual that really enjoys that sort of thing. But when it comes to an RPG, for instance, or a JRPG, because I'm going to lump that in with anime, they have to put the stakes so high because ultimately you're going to fight God every single time. And it can't just be walk into a room, have a conversation, a cup of tea, and say, you know what, I'm glad we resolved our differences. I'll see you next week. You can't do that. And I dare say sometimes that's because they're like, okay, what else can we do? Oh, we forgot about this thing. We'll make it a side quest. Dragon Quest XI. I love Dragon Quest XI. Did it need an epilogue? It's in your best interest to do it, to be completely honest. But after so many hours, do you even care? That's a question I had to ask myself. Do I even care what they're going to do? Because I knew it. I knew what they were going to do. I read through the lines. I've seen enough space love magic to know this shit is coming down the pipe. I did it, and it was worth it. I'll be completely honest. But would I do it again? No, because I already know. Would I play through that game again? Probably not. Because I got all I needed out of it. Final Fantasy X, I've replayed several times. Final Fantasy IV, I've replayed several times. Because to me, those stories are timeless, and I pick up something new every single time. I have no doubt the day will come where I don't get anything out of those characters anymore. And it's going to break my heart. It's really going to break my heart. That is partially the reason why, as much as I keep telling myself I need to replay Lunar, I still haven't done it. Because I'm afraid, A, the nostalgia is going to kill me. And B, literally, and B, that I'm just going to be like, you know what? Does it hit different? Yeah. Do I have anything new to add to it? No. And that is also something interesting. Like, even asking my buddy, I did ask him this after the fact. I said, have you ever reread any of your novels or anything you've written, just to see, like, who you were at that time and place? And he goes, yeah, and I was a bitch. Like, he's just like, no, he's like, seriously, though. He's like, I feel like, he's like, my style as a writer has definitely changed as I've gotten older. My perspective on things has definitely changed. His opinions on things, he's like, are largely the same, but his approach is ultimately very different. And I think that is also a testament to why certain games are remade or remastered. Final Fantasy VII, for instance, as at least of this recording, remake is kind of a deviation of the original game. And I have no doubt that Part 2, Rebirth, is going to be where stuff starts to really go off the rails. I mean, we even saw that in the Evangelion redo movies, where the first one is pretty much Season 1. And then the second one starts to be a little bit different. And then the next one's way different. But anyway, what do you guys think about video game stories as a whole? Do you think that they are reaching a point where, for you, the story is just getting in the way of your enjoyment? Maybe you really don't care about it and you kind of just stay away from that casual mode if you're into the story because you don't want to sacrifice gameplay. I think it's a really interesting push-pull mechanic based on that conversation I had with my friend, because I never thought of it like that. Anyway, I've been Alex, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.